Okay, so I see that people are still joining us, but of course I want to be very respectful of everybody's time. So happy to see that there are over 80 people here already, and I'm sure those numbers will just continue to go up as today goes forward. So on behalf of the Center on Race, Immigration, and Social Justice, welcome to the forum, Violence Against Indigenous Women Across the Americas. My name is Dr. Danielle Slakoff, and I'm an assistant professor of criminal justice here at Sacramento State University. I'm also a proud member of CRISJ. So today is International Women's Day and is part of Women's History Month. While today's topic will undoubtedly be heavy, we are very grateful for the opportunity to bring awareness to gender-based violence on an international scale today. Thank you so much for being here and for joining us. So before we get to our amazing slate of speakers today, I would like to thank the sponsors for today's event. Those include Sacramento State's Office of Inclusive Excellence, the Division of Criminal Justice, the Department of Environmental Studies, and the One World Initiative. I'd also like to acknowledge my friends and colleagues on the planning committee, without whom this event would not be possible today. That includes Manuel Barajas, Diego Bonilla, Ana Gutierrez, Maria Elena Martinez, Michael Ring, Heidi Sarabia, and Maria Vargas. So before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the land on which Sacramento State resides. Sacramento State is located on and continues to be occupied by the indigenous people of this area, the Miwok, Maidu, and Nisenan people. We honor their struggle for a better future in a world that has been impacted by colonialism and that has stolen, exploited, and destroyed human lives as well as environments. In solidarity with indigenous people across the Americas, we hope that this forum will provide you with knowledge and motivation to work towards social and environmental justice. This is just so that everybody in the audience knows that this event will be recorded and will be posted to the CRISJ website. If you have any questions for our keynote speaker or any of our amazing panelists, please use the Q&A tab below on your Zoom screen to put in questions. Okay, so finally, I'll wrap up this introduction. I just wanted to briefly show you the event agenda. So after I wrap up here, Katie Valenzuela, Director of the California Environmental Justice Alliance and our newly elected City Council member of Sacramento, will be giving a 30 to 40-minute talk. After that, we will open it up to about 30 minutes of question and answer from the audience. At 1:15, we will take a 15-minute break where you will see some visuals as well as hear some awesome music. And then at 1:30, we will have panel presentations by 4 community activists working to end violence against Indigenous women across the Americas. Professor Maria Vargas will moderate that panel, and there will be a question and answer at the end of that panel as well. And there will be translation services provided for that aspect. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'm thrilled to see so many amazing people here and willing to learn from City Council member Katie Valenzuela. Let me turn it over to you, City Councilwoman.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to the entire planning committee for putting together this very important event on a very important day. I'm really honored to be with you all, not just as a city council member for the city of Sacramento, but as an Indigenous woman. And I'm learning to start my talks with the statement that I am an Indigenous woman. And it is important that I start by saying that because a lot of what I want to talk about today involves visibility. Because visibility and recognition are foundational, not final, but foundational steps that we need to take to address the systemic issues that are leading to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives in Sacramento and across our country and planet. Now, I unfortunately can't tell you what tribe I'm from. This is a part of my story that I don't often talk about super publicly. I know enough from my family history and from what I was told to know that my grandfather's family was in the valley for hundreds of years, that my grandmother's family was relocated to Tejon Ranch area in Kern County. So we know enough, tracing birth certificates, tracing what information we could find to know that they were Indigenous, but we don't know where they were from. We don't know what tribe they belonged to before the colonizers came to California and did what they do. And it is a constant whole, I will say. It's something that I talk about a lot, actually, with my friends who are descendants of slaves, because we have a certain aspect in common of not really knowing the story of our past, knowing enough to know that there was harm, knowing enough to know who they were, some of them as people, but really not knowing where they came from before and just what that means to be so disconnected from our past, from our culture, from our traditions. And to not know is a constant harm that perpetuates, and it is this legacy of colonization, this practice that really renders our history and us as invisible. And it was not by accident, and I am not the only one with this story, not just in my family, where my sister and my cousins and my aunts would often tell people they were Mexican. And there's nothing wrong with being Mexican, but we just knew enough. I mean, we know there's some folks from Central and Southern America in our history, but I'd always ask them, why do you say that? I remember asking my aunt that in high school, saying, why do you say you're Mexican? I didn't think we were Mexican. And she's like, well, it's just easier. It's just easier to say that we're Mexican. People don't understand, and I don't feel right saying that we're indigenous, like that we're Native American. So I just say I'm Mexican because it's easier. And it is something that I took with me to college at UC Davis. We were talking before this webinar began about just the transformative experience I had at the Native American Studies department there with professors who really guided me and helped me figure out how to articulate my own story in the context of what has happened to too many California Native people, to too many Native people across this country and across this world who were victims of colonization. So that's the thing, though. I think, when we think about colonization, we think about exploitation and murder, but colonization also seeks to absorb people and places and stories and practices and into a new culture, into a different culture. And it rewrites history. It deems certain stories or perspectives as irrelevant, certain people as disposable. So fast forward to today for me. I remember learning that Sacramento had the second highest rate of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives in California that we know of, because part of the problem is the data and the tracking. We don't know fully the stories and of everybody who we've lost. But there's one terrible thing that all of those stories have in common, which is lack of visibility, lack of attention, lack of support, and not from their families or communities, of course, because I've heard so many stories of families just moving mountains to locate their family, to try to lift up those stories, to try to bring visibility. But I wanted to work, but from the rest of us, the broader community, the media, the decision makers, we weren't paying attention, and it was time for that to stop. So when Morningstar, who I know will be on the panel afterwards, hi Morningstar, sent me that report, we worked together to try to bring this issue forward to the City Council. I attended the walk that Restoring Justice for Indigenous Peoples and other groups helped organize. We held a community town hall, after which I can't tell you how many constituents and colleagues at the city reached out and said, I had no idea. I had no idea that this was an issue. I had no idea that this many folks, this many families, this many communities have been impacted by this crisis. And city staff who attended, which were not all of them, but there were a few there who left knowing what they needed to do. We connected those groups that participated with folks who oversee violence prevention in the city. We started to commit real dollars to the work. They started working on including those groups in RFPs and requests for proposals and budget allocations to try to start to correct what had been real neglect and oversight on the city's course part. But that's just the beginning. We also this year adopted a land acknowledgement, similar to what you heard Danielle just read before this began. And it seems symbolic, and in many ways it is, but it's also in other ways, when you think about the power of starting every meeting as a city body, every single meeting we start by standing and verbally recognizing the people who are here, the people who have been here, the people who remain among us. And what that means as we debate on the rest of our meetings, city budgets, city policies, we hear updates on city programs, and that this is now front of mind is how are our Native communities being served by this? How are they being included? And what can we be doing to bring those communities into this work? So I'm so grateful for the work that Morningstar and so many others are doing in our community, not just the tangible ways that they're helping, but for finally teaching me how important it is for me to start by saying, I am an Indigenous woman. I am here, regardless of what's been taken from my family, what is still impacting us, we are here. So I want to talk a little bit about things we can do, because as Danielle said, sometimes this topic is overwhelming, and it is due to actions and systems that have been in place for long before any of our time, that we hope won't persist too far beyond our time, but that are here and that we are operating within. So I want to say that acknowledging Native people is not just about doing the land acknowledgement and saying whose land you're on and putting that in your Zoom handle. It's also not saying things like you're a native of Sacramento, unless you actually are a native person from Sacramento. I think I will never forget at Davis, a professor of mine, we were doing an orientation for new grad students, and someone said I was 4th generation from Carmel. And this professor said, oh my goodness, I've never met anybody else whose family has been here for that long. I'm not joking. He literally said those words. And I looked at him and said, no, I know millions of people whose families have been here longer than 4 generations. And it just sort of washed over him. But I don't think people are very conscious when they say things like, well, I'm a farmer and I've had this land for 5 generations or 6 generations, like what they're saying, and how important it is for them to re-examine those assertions and what that means. Like somebody said that to me once, and in my head immediately I thought, oh, okay, so your family directly was involved in taking the land. Your family was directly involved probably in what happened here to the Native people of the Sacramento area. And I think having those conversations is hard, but being conscious of the words that we use and being conscious of how we put our own story into context of who have been here, who remain here, is really important, and something that each of us can take more seriously and elevate in our daily conversations and interactions. It also means reaching out to Native voices to make sure they're included, not as tokens, but as partners. And this may mean adjusting your process. This may mean going back a few steps to ensure folks are included and have meaningful input. This also means helping with resources for those of us that administer grants, for those of us who do programs and research projects. This means actually recognizing that the need for capacity to engage in these conversations. Native people deserve those resources. They deserve to be able to participate fully as partners. And then sometimes that means compensating Native groups for participation. This is something I believe across the board with community engagement. I'll just say as a sidebar for all of you in research and doing the work, that we have to value that time and really invest in making sure that people can be meaningfully at the table and dedicate the time and energy to participating fully with their community. This also means, again, speaking to the academics in the room and the researchers and the budding students, not erasing us from your data charts. In grad school, I remember, again, not the same professor as before, a different professor presenting some charts in a class about data trends in the Sacramento area. And Native Americans weren't on there. We were gone. And I remember raising my hand during the presentation and saying, well, why aren't Native American people on this chart? And he's like, oh, well, they were just, 0.2% of the data that we looked at, and it didn't make sense to include them. That's not okay. It's not okay. It's a phrase that I remember finding in grad school called statistical extinction. We are still here, but because we're so small in number, you decide not to include us. And it's how I believe crises like missing and murdered Indigenous relatives get to this epidemic point, because it is small numbers when you think about 2 people, 10 people, 12 people, but in the context of a community, that is huge. And we are missing that because we are only paying attention to the big data trends, and we're not drilling down to look at the Native community, to look at what's happening in that data, to understand the level and how hard those advocates had to fight to get, and those families to get visibility on the crisis that we now all know to be present among us. This would not have happened if we hadn't been so quick to round out the Native population in our data, and so quick to overlook those small numbers as statistically insignificant, when we know that is not the case. And we are hearing those stories finally today. So while I think another thing as well, we've talked a lot about the crisis in Ukraine, and obviously our thoughts are with the civilians that are impacted by this war and budding war, but we also have to not forget the ongoing pain and urgent need for support in the communities that are right here among us. I think I've seen many of my friends post that if you're posting about Ukraine, if you're upset about Ukraine, that's fine. You can do both that and recognize some of the issues that are happening right here in our own community, the legacy of genocide and murder, but also the ongoing pain and the ongoing need for attention and support. We can do both things, but we rarely see that. We see Gabby Petito in the news, and we say for a brief moment, wow, why aren't women of color getting this attention? Why aren't, I'll look at all these numbers of missing and murdered women who have not been recognized at this level. And we say, gosh, that's not right. But we still fail to follow through, and we still haven't addressed the systems. And since Gabby Petito's murder, there have been many women who have been deemed missing. There are many other women who have been murdered who have still not gotten that attention. Right here in Sacramento, actually, we had a really tragic murder in my district, a young girl of color, Isabel, who was murdered in the CV Circle part of my district, the housing south of Broadway. Is part of my district that has seen historic disinvestment, segregation. And the next morning, I will never forget getting a call from an advocate in that community who said, I want the same response that Old Sac got. Old Sac had a shooting last month. A young person was killed. The whole city mobilized. The whole city got there. They had $5 million. We put in place motions. I want her to have the same response that Old Sacramento got, that the privileged part of our community got. And I said, okay. And we worked as hard as we could to elevate the community's demands, to have community meetings, to get investment into that neighborhood. And we made some great progress. But I will tell you today, looking back at that response, it was not the same response as what we saw in Old Sacramento. It was not. Even with everything we tried to do to elevate her death and her life and how much that mattered and what we needed to do to try to correct and prevent future incidents like that from happening, we did not get close. We did not get as close as we should have to the response in a more affluent part of our community. And that does break my heart, but it also was a reminder of, and I say that story as an example of a small way in which we can all start using our voices. We can all start using our social media to elevate and to demand the same response, because we always say we can do both things, but we never do. We always say, sad for Ukraine, sad for Gabby Petito, but we forget all of the other people right here in our backyard who deserve that level of attention and sadness and advocacy as well. So I say all of this to say, colonization is among us. We are all impacted by it. None of us are immune, including myself. We are all living in these systems that were created in really harmful ways. And to be truly revolutionary, to truly connect to the systems that keep reinforcing the idea that some lives are worth more than others, are less important than others. We will need your help. We will need all of us calling for justice. We will need all of us confronting every day the stories we see, the way we talk about these challenges, and how we can be helping lift up the people who have been here, who remain here, and who continue to need our support and our advocacy and our allyship in a real and meaningful way. So of course, I knew you gave me 30 minutes and I would not get anywhere close to that, because I really want to hear more from the panel because Morningstar on here and others just have so much wisdom to give. But I will close out there for the Q&A section here and just invite you all, if you have questions or comments, to chime in. But thank you again, Danielle and Manuel and the entire Planning Commission committee for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Katie. So if you are here and would like to ask a question, if you could use the Q&A section, that would be awesome. Katie, I'll start you off with a question that I kind of mentioned to you in an email. I'd love to hear a little bit more about. I know that right now you are very focused on issues facing unhoused people in Sacramento, and I was wondering if you saw any overlap between these two issues that we're talking about today and the unhoused issue.
Absolutely. Homelessness and housing insecurity disproportionately continues to impact people of color across the spectrum. It's the numbers don't lie. And believe me, I ask about the native numbers when they give me their statistics and data. And it is a source of extreme vulnerability for folks in that position that leads to trafficking. It can lead to abusive relationships. It can lead to a whole host of systemic violence that really impacts people who are not just folks who are homeless right now, but for folks who are at risk of homelessness. You know, you think about people who stay in relationships because they don't know how to leave, where they can go if they can afford housing. You think about people who maybe couch surf with people that they don't know that well because they're trying to avoid being out on the street. And you think about folks who are actually out on the street and what happens, particularly to women and LGBTQ individuals. It is systemic violence that is felt very acutely among a very vulnerable population that is disproportionately, as I mentioned, people of color as well. So it is the intersections here. Housing justice is social justice. You know, housing shouldn't be a commodity. We are really, when you really want to talk about colonial systems and what how this is manifesting again today, our housing market is a great example of that. You know, how we buy and sell land, how speculation is working. It is the root of so many of these systems and how they're reinforcing generational wealth, how they're reinforcing security, and how they are continuing to displace and harm communities through today. And when you look at the trends now of like investor-owned conglomerates that are coming in and buying properties, you know, you're looking at these really startling trends where people are getting access to land from tax auctions or from code violations or receiverships that are impacting people of color who have not been able to hold on to their home for whatever reason. And nobody really thinks, I think, about where people are going to go. You know, there's new studio apartments in my district that are starting at $3,000 a month. $3,000 a month for a studio apartment. And I think, how would you, I couldn't probably not afford that. I could, you know, like, I don't know who could afford that. And so we really, the land is such an important component still today, and how we gain ownership of that land as a community so that we can continue to keep space and bring back in the people who have been displaced from our communities. So things like community land trusts and other efforts in Sacramento are just so important, because you can't build more land. Land is sacred, land is here. And it is, so important for us to recognize that trend and how it is just reinforcing those systems that were in place back when Native people were first met by colonization in this place.
Thank you so much for sharing those powerful words. It's very fascinating to hear your story and how it connects to this issue. I had no idea until you started speaking today. So thank you for sharing that. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing how you feel that these issues have been received now that you're on City Council and now that you're talking about these issues on a larger stage.
It has been an interesting process, I will say. I'm trying to, don't want to out any particular colleagues or questions that were received, because I think part of me thinks it's good for people to ask questions because it prompts, it gives an opportunity for education, right? I think what saddens me sometimes is when those questions are directed when Native people are being forced to justify why they need this response over and over again. And a great example would be when we adopted our land acknowledgement as a city. We invited Chairman Tarango to come join us. We had different advocates on the call, and one of my colleagues said, well, why honor Native people? Like, why shouldn't we honor everybody who's here? You know, and it was just and I watched their faces when that question landed, and I was sad that they had, but then as soon as I could, I tried to interject. So I'm like, this isn't their job to like continue to remind us why there have been harms, why the Native people deserve this recognition. This is also all of our job. And my colleagues and I stepped in to try to answer the question as to why this was so important. But it really is, it's such a systems issue when you think about our system of education. And I don't need to tell anybody on this call, you think about all of these systems that really reinforce the colonial story and really erase the story of what happened that led to a grown person who's an elected representative saying, well, why are we honoring Native people and not acknowledging other people who've been on this land, not understanding why that was such a baseline fundamental issue that he was even asking that question. So I think it's hard because I want to promote question asking when folks don't understand, because I want to promote understanding and learning. But I think we have a very long way to go. And I think the best way that I was able to break it down was with the budget. And I think, we still have a long way to go on this. But I remember when I met with our Office of Violence Prevention, I asked the very simple question if we funded any Native serving groups, because it had been brought to my attention that the city is currently not funding any Native serving organizations directly. And it was one of those moments where they legitimately did not realize. It was just did not realize, had been focusing on like brown and black communities in North and South Sacramento, did not even realize that they had this blind spot. And I was really proud of how they responded to that. I was really proud of how open they were to like, oh my goodness, you're right. Like we aren't funding any of these orgs. We want to meet with them and figure out how we can correct this. And so there's still a lot of work to do, but I think the money too is the ultimate reflection of our values. How we're investing in our community really does speak volumes to our priorities. And I'm really continue to be committed to trying to figure out how we can put our money behind this commitment. The land acknowledgement was just that, and in that meeting, we kind of pushed for, well, hey, let's put another 100,000 into the Native American Health Center. Let's do something that's real, that's not just acknowledging. And that's the last thing we've done. That was several months ago. And so we need to keep being pushed, and we need to keep pushing for us to make that land acknowledgement meaningful by action and by investment and by commitment to our values that we state at the beginning of every meeting now.
We had an audience question. I'll go with the first one. So as minorities, how can we keep working to bring awareness besides being involved in city council, bringing up issues and awareness? What's the best way to be patient enough and fight the system that oppressed us, but keeping composure in order to be listened to?
I love that question. I think, and there's great solidarity, I think, across communities of color, right? And there's this great example of recently there was a mural program that the city ran, a publicly funded community mural program. And in the end, when we came out of that mural program, we realized that no Chicano Latino artists had been selected as lead artists. And it wasn't because they didn't apply, right? And I remember the first emails I got that next morning, were not from Chicano Latino artists. It was from Black run organizations. It was from Black artists who said, this isn't okay. They had been included in the funding in some ways, but they were like, wait, this isn't okay. Like they need to be included as well. How do we fix this? And I pointed that out to some of the artist groups who did come forward and have been advocating and working with the city since, that I think there is great power in us working together to uplift each other's struggles and to uplift each other's voices. To have that solidarity among communities of color is a powerful thing. And it is something that I think even for allies that are not people of color, right, or that are not identified, I think having that, listening to folks like Morningstar, and I see her on the screen, and I almost want her to answer this question as well, but I know she's talking on the panel too, of the, listening to the community, being willing to learn, being willing to ask the question, and to really use your capacity, your time, your space to lift each other up. Because sometimes you're going to find yourself in a room that somebody isn't in, and you can ask the question, hey, why aren't, why we're missing a voice here in this conversation, I think is important, or lifting each other up in that way, but also finding beauty in community. I get great, it really fills my cup. The things that fill my cup the most are those community events like that march that happened in April for Missing, and to be in community and to hear the songs and to, smell the sage and the, just to be in that space with each other and to feel that solidarity. Like my family hadn't been directly impacted, but I was feeling that that community with the families that were affected. And it just, I think finding space to be with each other is so important. And honestly, in the COVID pandemic, that has been a real issue, right? Is that we've been just so isolated from each other and so isolated in our own struggles and our own communities that we're not connecting with each other again. And so I think now that, knock on wood, things seem a little safer to get out and gather. I always want to couch that because I don't want us to backslide. How do we be intentional about creating space, about enjoying art, about enjoying food, about going to cultural events for each other so that we're also filling our cup and not just struggling, because the system of colonization as I say, I try to use present tense language when I talk about colonization because it is very much alive among us. It is hard. It is exhausting. It is, this is why my aunt, when I say, why do you tell people you're Mexican? And she was just like, it's just easier, it's just easier than having to keep explaining, over and over and over again to people who don't understand. I actually remember a guy in college argue with me once when I said I was Native American. He's like, no, you're not. Your last name is Valenzuela. You're probably from Mexico. And I was like, what? Like, do you not know? Like, do you not know how like missions work? Do you not know what the Spanish did here? Like, I don't understand. It was just and it is exhausting, but we have to be very mindful of how we fill our cup, how we build with each other, how we share space with each other, so that we are resilient amongst that challenge, that we keep coming back and we keep pushing back and we keep raising those issues again and again and again, as frustrating as it is, because that is what slow but sure progress. This is us dismantling this brick by brick. Every time we bring forward these voices, like colonization and stories that they're trying to set aside, we are dismantling that system brick by brick. We're making it harder for them to continue to pretend that we don't exist and that we don't have these struggles. So I will just say that I think it is so important for us to find ways to fill each other's cup, and I find art and food and events like that to just be that way for me. Going to the powwow last year was like, I think it was one of the first big in-person gatherings I was, and it was great because it was outdoors. And I was just sitting on these bleachers. I wasn't there to give a speech or to like go around and take photos with everybody. I just sat in these bleachers and watched the dancing and listened to the songs and just let it kind of wash over me. And I left feeling restored. And so I think it's important to be mindful of the struggle and to not let colonization win by letting it fatigue us in this constant fight that we have before us.
Thank you so much for those wise words and giving us the perspective from the City Council. We had another audience question. Violence against Indigenous women is an ongoing crisis with roots deep in our colonial history. What recommendations do you have for creating a larger public conversation to illuminate new pathways to action?
Oh, I love that. And I'm sure, again, I don't want to get too far ahead of our panel of community advocates on this, because I'm sure they have lots of ideas on that. But I do think spaces like this are important. I think that things like, Zoom town halls, events, like you notice the poster behind me, that's there every council meeting. I keep it there for me and I keep it there for others, but like finding ways to just keep it visible in the space. It doesn't always have to be as big and overt as saying, I want to have a special item just on this issue. Sometimes it's like in the budget conversations as we're getting ready to start as a city here moving forward for 2022. Like, okay, where are the Native organizations in this? Hey, youth team, can you talk to me about the progress? Violence prevention team, can you talk to me about the outreach, and in those little ways as well? So I think this is why I like the land acknowledgement practice, because it does keep it front of mind at the beginning of every meeting. And so that hopefully during the meeting, you're looking for those opportunities to insert those questions and those points and perspectives so that they don't continue to get overlooked. But I will say, I will defer to the panel on the big things, because I think there are organizers and families directly impacted who are working really hard on visibility, on events. And I think the best we can do is to stay tapped into those orgs and to make sure that when we see an opportunity to show up, that we do. When we see an opportunity to demonstrate with them, to stand shoulder to shoulder in protest or in advocacy, that we do. So I will leave the rest of that to the panel to describe.
Awesome. And we had another question. What can other people of color do to help bring awareness to the plight of Indigenous people?
A lot of what, we're saying, right? I think, recognizing, standing up, listening to those voices. Like we talk about like amplification, and you hear it a lot with women in professional circles, right? Where like I hear a woman say something and maybe her idea doesn't catch, and so I repeat the idea again, and then that idea catches, then maybe another woman on the table is like, no, that idea that like like number one said was actually a really good one, and we should. So it's amplification sometimes is a really big thing. When we sat, and I will give an example of UC Davis again, because I'm an alumni from there, as you can tell, but when Aggie Square was happening, I remember, when we sat at that table, with the associate deans presenting this idea, I was on an advisory committee for UC Davis at the time. I said, this is this is another act of colonization. You are coming into land. You say, we bought this land. We're going to rename this land. We're going to rebuild this land for our purpose, with no consciousness about the communities around it and what this means for them and how they can, but not just be not harmed by this, but how they might benefit and where are they in this, right? Like, how are they coming into this? And I remember saying that, and then somebody else spoke about something else because they had the assistant chancellor's year, and so they wanted to make a pitch for something. And then my friend Trey, who's a Black man, when he got a chance to speak, he's like, I want to bring back what he said. It was just like it was sort of this moment where he's like, I want to talk about that. Like it was just this moment that just lifting up, because I think it's too easy for folks to say, oh yes, very good point, and then move on. And it's like, no, that thing they said, that's important, and that's a lot of what I see my job is on council, is to be that megaphone for the community, to say like, oh no, like this is important. We need to stop saying we value racial equity and start really talking about what that means in terms of dollars, in terms of policies, in terms of practices. And then when I say it and they say, okay, good job, and then my colleague, Councilmember Vang, will stand up and say, oh yes, no, I agree, and we should do and then so it's like, I think being really conscious of how we are amplifying each other. And that's what solidarity, I think, really looks like, is sometimes using your time and space to lift up what you're hearing from another community that is being overlooked, to make sure that their voices are being heard, and seeing that as a common destiny, seeing this as all connected. It is all of us against colonization. It is all of us against racial inequity. It is all of us for social justice. And so when I see one of my comrades in the corner saying like, wait a minute, what about us? And they're not being heard, it's me using my space to say, hey, that's important too. And like, how do we bring this in? What do we do to make this right? So I say that's really important, just to be conscious and aware. And your participation in webinars like this is a big step in that direction, right? To learn, to hear from advocates and experts in the field who are doing and leading this work. Like, I'm going to keep using Morning Stars because I see her on my screen, but like Morning Star and others, to say, okay, now I know who this person is, and now I'm going to be on the lookout for that. When I see her posting, or I see Restoring Justice for Indigenous Peoples posting, I'm going to share that to my networks. I'm going to get some friends. We're going to go out to that march next year so that we can help support them as well.
Absolutely. So if anybody else has any more questions, please put it in the Q&A. I'm curious, because you've mentioned that you and Morningstar have worked together before. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about how that came to be, and how you got more closely linked to this. Of course, you shared your Indigenous history earlier, but curious about that because you mentioned it earlier.
Well, I mean, I've been fangirling Morningstar for a little while. She's been pretty involved in local advocacy to protect Black lives, very active in protests and with organizations locally that have been fighting against police violence, that have been fighting for, disinvestment, reinvestment, and protection. I mean, I knew of her in those spaces, and she just, I think, cold emailed me one day and said, hey, have you seen this report? We'd like you to participate in this event. And I read the report and was just stunned, because I didn't know, like I said in the beginning, I didn't realize how many missing and murdered Indigenous relatives were from Sacramento. I didn't know these names. I had never heard these stories, and it just struck me immediately. And I cleared my, there's some other big march happening that day, and I'm like, I'm going to this first. I'm going to be there. I want to understand, and getting to see those families and the banners they were holding, and to hear from the community directly really sparked me following up with her and saying, okay, now what does this look like? How do we help? So it has been a town hall so far virtually. It has been, some conversation, but I think we still have a long way to go. There's been some conversation about things like renaming Sutter's Landing, things like, really starting to continue the valiant work she's done to get these monuments addressed, to address this legacy of these idols we've put up on these pedestals like Columbus that, you scratch under the surface and you're like, wait a minute, this is not someone that, we want to lift up as a hero of Sacramento. This is someone who did a lot of harm when they were alive, and we need to include that in the story if we're going to be truly honoring Native people locally. So I've already learned so much from Morningstar and just this last year working together, and I think we still have a lot to do to really make things right, but I'm hopeful with the steps we're taking, with the steps that my colleague Councilmember Vang has been pushing, that we're starting to open up the city process to examination and to deeper evaluation of how we do that to keep it from happening again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that background. Somewhat related, audience member asked, there are many Indigenous women who have gone missing or killed. South Dakota alone has numbers of almost 67% of those missing. being Native American. While that's not here in Sacramento, what will you say to our local community, many people that are here that are Sacramento natives, people that live in Sacramento, and why is it important and why this still impacts us here in California?
It's, I mean, this is a disease that is so foundational to, unfortunately, who we are as a country, right? And I hear those numbers and I don't have words. I think that we can't say, if you had cancer, and I said, hey, it's cool, I got it out of your arm. It's still in your kidney and it's still in your stomach, but at least your arm is clear. I wouldn't be like, yay, I beat cancer. I would say, okay, I need to get all of it. And I think what our struggle and why I use words like solidarity so often and why I talk about kind of the bigger, it's Sacramento. We are a symptom of a much deeper, much broader, much bigger fight. And us winning this fight does not simply mean that the groups in Sacramento, that the people who live here have what they need. That's not enough. That's important. And that's a step we want to get to, but that's not enough. If right around us, people are still suffering, if just outside of our community, people are still suffering, because we are not going to be good until we stamp this out for all of us. And really address those root systems issues for all of us. It's not just about vulnerability and the long-termness of us, our protections here, because, I think that any local solution is always vulnerable to changing and, people moving on and new council members coming in and changes in political appetite or political power. This needs to be a systems level change, and that's only going to happen at the scale by which we're also addressing what happens in South Dakota. We're also addressing what happens in Washington and in every state in the country. That is the scale that a long-term solution is, not just for us, but for everybody. And so I think it's just so important for us to keep that in perspective, that, what Sacramento City can and should do is important and needs to be done. And we need to keep working at those challenges, but that is not the solution. We should also be thinking about, I'm a big believer in local electeds using their voice with state electeds, for example, right? Because we have their phone numbers, they represent our area. I talk to them. How am I pushing them on this issue? Our congresswoman, how am I pushing her on this issue? How do we use our voice and the privilege of this position that we've been elected to for however long we hold it to really amplify, again, the megaphone of these issues at other levels of government? How do we show up for the solution that lasts, not just the thing that we can control here in Sacramento? So definitely heartbreaking to hear that. And I think our struggle and what I see, I hope some of the work that I can help with is bigger than, will hopefully help them as well, because that is the level of change that we need to see. This needs to be from the very top of the federal government and beyond, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. And they had another question. How can we bring in more multilingual information or even representation at City Council? Many non-English speakers or those who are English as a second language could feel more included and even address these issues that we might not know about.
Oh, I yes, love that question. It is a huge frustration. It's not just at the council, it's at all these other boards as well. It's every space where decisions are being made. I mean, I worked in the legislature. I never went to a hearing that was broadcast in more than one language or had interpretation available. I mean, this is a deep level issue and a systemic inequality. And for a city like Sacramento, where I think about a third of our population, English is not the first language. It's like, this is an incredible oversight to say a whole segment of our population just isn't going to know what's happening. So we are doing an audit right now for ourselves. And what I hope that will do is really build a best practice that we can take to all the other boards around what does it look like, not just to have language available, but to actually reach communities that don't necessarily speak English or English is not their first language. And that is going to be a very deep process. And there's certain urgency in play here. Like, I think a lot about, like, I have a whole community, I can visualize them, the blocks that they're on of monolingual Cantonese speakers in my district. And to date, I have not figured out how to reach them. And it's a whole community of my constituents that I don't know how to reach them if there was a crisis, if there was a flood that was coming. I mean, this is a real issue. It's a safety issue for them, but it also means that the decisions I'm making today haven't yet included their needs, that they may have things that they need that I still have no idea about. And as an elected official, that's not okay. And our city really isn't set up to help with that. There are members like, again, I'll keep lifting up my Vang, not just because she's my sister on the council, but she's done a phenomenal job of bringing in organizations with people who are community leaders and organizers in those languages, in those communities, to help her get the word out about vaccines, about different community events that she's doing. And it's been really incredible. And I think the city's learning from that and starting to say, okay, how do we make that part of our system so that we are actually hearing from these voices continuously? I got the chance to do one like trilingual workshop on the general plan before I was elected in South Sacramento. And I remember this Mandarin speaking elder saying like, well, I never ride the bus. It was like a table we were asking them about transportation, right? And I said, well, why? He's like, well, the stops were only announced in English. I'm worried I'm going to miss my stop. I mean, those are automatic stop announcements, right? Like how easy would it be for us to record that in a few more languages so that they're in, like just announcing the stops? And I said, well, why do you think that hasn't changed? And it was so simple. He's like, no one's ever asked me why I don't ride the bus. I just don't ride the bus. And I always use that anecdote because I'm like, that's something that we could easily address that would immediately improve his quality of life, would make him feel heard and included, that he could use a system that he's helping pay for, that he should be entitled to use. But we never knew because we never even asked him. And so it's just, I think that there's just so much, and then representation is a big part of that. It's like having people in the offices who think about, hey, where are the Spanish speakers? Where are the Cantonese speakers? Hey, wait a minute, why aren't we hearing from these communities? And how are we getting the word to them so they even know what's happening? And so that's one piece of it, but then the systems, and again, I'll keep saying the investment in the systems so that we aren't just leaning on staff who happens to speak a second language, but that we're actually investing in professionalizing that system so that it's meaningful and systemic enough to be lasting.
Absolutely. I found this question, another one that came in from an audience member. They started with, it seems like in the civil rights era, we had more connection with other groups of color. We were able to support each other more so than today. I was not aware of how horrendous the rape and murder of Indigenous women were until I saw the film Wind River. I do not want that movie to be my primary source. Are there any websites, et cetera, available so that we can be more informed and supportive? And I just want to throw this in. Brenda, thank you for the question. Many of my students also share that this was their first time learning about this issue was through this film. So I'm very interested in what your thoughts are on this one.
Yeah, and I will say, draw attention to the link that Morningstar just put into the chat. It's the report that she first sent me last April March, actually, when she invited me to the march that was in April. And it is, and the data and the information, I mean, this is a big part of the problem. It's not super well documented. The story isn't out there. We tell, I think movies and stories like that are so powerful because it evokes, it helps people understand through that experience of whether it's a one person experience or a community experience. But this is a big part of the request, right? Is that like we do a better job at the government level and in the research spheres in universities of documenting this, of starting to crack into what are the contributing factors, is the media, like of these people that we know who are Indigenous that were missing or murdered, what was the media coverage for them, starting to actually quantify this so that we can make a stronger policy argument to the state legislature, to the federal government for those resources, for that investment in those practices, to educate reporters on like why that story is so heartbreaking. Again, I feel bad using Gabby Petito's name in this way because she was a person and her death was really tragic in its own right. But there's so many amazing visuals that came out of that said, wait a minute, just story after story of Indigenous women that have been completely absent from the national news, despite the same level of concern from her communities and families. So it's something that we need. And I will say we, in the global sense as decision makers, but we in general as a community, we need to do that work. That is part of the work that is ahead of us. How do we better dissect what is happening and what isn't happening in these cases so that we can start really pinpointing where those systems changes need to happen with data to back up those really powerful stories from movies like Wind River. So, but definitely read that report. That Morningstar.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that link, Morningstar. I really appreciate it. And that's in the chat for those of you who may just be listening and not watching. There is a link in the chat that you can click on. A few more questions have come in. I think that you're such a dynamic speaker. More and more questions are coming front to mind. I will read Martha's. So Martha states, I live in the central San Joaquin Valley, Yokuts and Miwok lands. I apologize if I mispronounced that, Martha. For me, raising the narrative to understand that this violence is happening daily. The reality is that we need to unite. And here in Merced, we are aligning ourselves with the Cinco de Mayo celebration in our community and creating a red dress awareness section with indigenous flavor. I feel like this creates a provocative discussion for the community to ask how and why, and there is a oneness. We can't allow modern day colonialism to continue to pervade our mindset. We need to awaken our ancestors within us. To unite is to empower. Women have always been the target. What do you think?
Very well said.
I know.
I don't know what else. Well, no, I'm just so happy to hear, because I mean, I'm from the Kern County area, right? And I'm on Yokuts land, and it's just so powerful to hear. And this is what I mean in terms of solidarity and filling the cup. I think, that you're on this webinar listening to a Sacramento person talk about what's happening up here and the panel after. But I think that is so brilliant. I mean, that example of like kind of tapping into a Cinco de Mayo event that everybody loves to go put on their mildly offensive attire and go out and drink margaritas, to really like use that opportunity to put Native voices front and center, to elevate this really important narrative, is really powerful. And I appreciate that you've done that or are doing that work, and just am kind of now thinking like, gosh, we should do that in Sacramento. That's again, solidarity is also sometimes getting inspired from our siblings in other regions that are doing great things. But yeah, I think the story of women, the story of women of color, particularly the story of non-binary people, right? I mean, this is a story that is continuing to unfold in front of us. And the only way I think to really interrupt it is to start by visibility, and then to continue to follow up with advocacy, to follow up with funding. That is so important.
Another person asked, are there volunteer options or any other ways for us to get involved, give an opportunity to get exposed and bring up topics, issues? Is there a suggestion email or mailbox that people could maybe speak to you about some issues?
I will defer to the orgs that are on the panel for that. I mean, they're always welcome to reach out to me with ideas. Obviously, as a council member, always get those constituents and love hearing ideas and thoughts people have about events they want to do or things they'd like me to host in the community. Always open to that. But I definitely think the support is needed for the advocates in the community, the folks doing the work on the ground. And so I will defer to them in terms of how you can best help the work, because that's usually how I try to approach it, is by asking how I can be helpful. Sometimes I think folks try to be helpful and can sometimes go around the leaders and the voices that need to be centered in the movement and need to be leading the movement. So I think deferring to the organizations that are leading this work in Sacramento and beyond is going to be my answer. But if folks have specific ideas for me, I'm happy to put my email in the chat and folks can follow up as well.
Thank you. Another audience member said, Sacramento is still severely underrepresented in political leadership by warrior women of color. What mentoring opportunities are there to network for women interested in running for office? Oh, I love the question, because I think more people should run. And I think, I tell a lot about my story of running because, traditionally part of the reason you see that inequity is because, when I first finally decided that I wanted to run, which took a lot of thought and reflection and discussion with my community, was, okay, cool. So you need $10,000 to start. And I was like, I don't have $10,000. And they're like, oh, maybe your family can give you $10,000. Like, my family does not have $10,000. And so maybe you can loan yourself $10,000. I'm like, this isn't a question of loaning or having, this is a question of like, there's no $10,000 that exists for me to start. And so we had to figure out how to start without that startup capital. And this is why so often you don't see advocates in these positions. You don't see working people in these positions. You don't see a lot of single moms or people in the community that are doing this work in those positions because we don't have the privilege to start with that base of support and funding. And so I'm a big
I will tell everybody, you know, about getting started, and tell anybody who wants to run that I will sit down with them and give them an hour to talk them through how we did that with the grassroots fundraising, because it was very nerve-wracking. I'm like, I'm not going into debt by running this campaign. That was like one of my hard and fast truths. And we figured it out. So I want to help people understand how accessible it can be. It's really about work. It's really about being authentic to your own values, and really how you build community around yourself. Like those are the ways that successfully running for office. And it is, I think too many people decide not to, because they don't have the PhD, or they don't have the law degree, or they don't have like whatever resume builder. And I do think, I will say that it's important that you have that community experience, right? I think that it's important for you to be connected in that community that you're fighting to represent in some way, whatever that is. But I do think that too many of us talk ourselves out of it. And the people who don't talk themselves out of it are overwhelmingly the more affluent folks. They're more likely male, they're more likely to be white. And it's just, that's the part of the trend that I believe so firmly in, is like, I will support, and I always tell people, I may not always agree with your policy, but I will help you figure out how to get started, because it is important to me that people run, because it's important, as you mentioned, that we have representation and that we have people who are willing to push the buttons in those offices. It's also really important, though, that you run for the right reasons, and that you run not just to run. You know, I know too many people that get too invested in staying in office than in making the change. And something that I've always told people is, I'm like, even if I'm a one-term council member, I'm not going to let the threat or the risk of reelection stop me from doing what I think is right. And that's a hard line to draw, because there are going to be moments where you're going to be presented with this fork in the road, right? And they're going to say, you know, you do this, you might not get reelected, but if you do that, then it's the right thing for you to do. And you have to be willing to risk that, to run. And if you are, then you'd be a powerful elected official.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to point out, for those of you who may be listening and not watching, that Katie did put her email in the chat. And we also had Martha share some information about how to get involved, as well as Morningstar putting an email in there for volunteer opportunities as well. So just wanted to draw people's attention to it, because I know not everyone is maybe watching right now. On the note of being in city council and running as a woman of color, I wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind sharing what brought you to that moment. You are newly elected in your very early days, so I'm curious what brought you to that moment. And as we have learned today, you are centering so many issues near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, and I hope you can hear me okay. An army of leaf blowers just started outside of my window, which is why I had to go run and close it. So what really, I mean, I've been organizing for years, and had been doing everything from urban agriculture ordinances to helping neighborhoods start, to taking them to planning commission, to fight projects. I loved what I did, and I had no interest in stepping into the spotlight, even though people kept saying, you should run, you should run, you should run. The moment that really changed it for me, and I've told this story a lot, because it is really like, rarely do you get the gift of like a moment where your decision is made, where you can see it so vividly. And I remember it was a winter night, it was raining. I stopped at a Thai restaurant downtown and picked up some food. I was coming back, I think from a trip from the airport or whatever, before I went home, and I was waiting for my food. And this older Black gentleman walked in with his stuff. You could tell, like, it was obvious that he was unhoused. He had his belongings with him, and he had gotten this few dollars from the day, and he was just asking for some rice and veggies and some hot water. And the staff treated him great and sat him down, and he was having this this moment of relief. You could tell there was this moment where he just sat down, he belonged, he was being treated well, he had some warmth, he had some food. And I got my food and I went into my car and I just started sobbing. I started sobbing because I could not imagine how we had let the crisis get to that point. It was not okay. I knew what was going to happen when that man left. He was going to be looking for a safe place to sleep. He was going to be outside in the cold and the wet and the dark on his own. And I mean, he looked like he was in his 70s, right? I mean, this was just, it was so just wrong. And I needed that moment to remind me that it wasn't about me running for office. Like, I needed to run for him. I needed to run for the people that weren't being heard in city government, that needed that voice. And so many people who have these concerns about homelessness and whatever we're doing, it's like, again, their fate is our fate. Like, if we can't take care of the people that are suffering in our community, then we will all be impacted by this. This is our greatest responsibility, is to figure this out. And that is a big part of why I decided to run. But it has not been easy. It has been a struggle. I remember joking that I will never forget in one of my early endorsement interviews with my opponent, who was a white male. And I gave this very specific response to a question they gave. And I had policy, I had receipts, right? Like, this city does it like this, and this is what this law says, and this is how this could work. And I remember he just sat there and said, well, I disagree. And that was it. That's all he said. And they were just like, oh, well, Ms. Valenzuela, what do you say to that? And I'm like, I just gave you all of this knowledge and all of this information, and I don't understand. And what I realized of reflecting, because I left and I was so angry after this interview, I'm like, why am I feeling like this? And I'm like, oh, it's because I felt like I had to work so much harder to be heard and to make my case. And then it was easily dismantled by somebody saying, oh no, she doesn't understand how it works. And that was all he was saying. And they were taking his word. And I couldn't understand why I wasn't being heard. And I guess you could say that as of now, there is a fire in my chest that this role has given me that is building. And I'm not letting it dominate me. I'm not letting it change me. That was another promise I made myself. I'm not going to let this job change who I am. But there is a certain fire in my chest every time this happens, every time someone drags me in the mud, every time someone ignores me, every time they talk down to me or do things that are just so frustrating based on my resume, based on who I am. Like, why do you think this is okay? And I'm trying to channel that. It's funny, my therapist, I always talk about my therapist very open, by the way, because if you're not in therapy, we all should be. And let's just own that, especially as people of color, especially as women in this field. But I remember just today, I was talking to her and she's like, knives can have multiple purposes, right? Like, you can have a scalpel that is used strategically to heal people, or you can stab somebody. And so your anger, it's like, you got to focus on the scalpel. You got to focus on the precision. How are you using it? How are you directing it? You don't want to just let it go crazy and start attacking people for who they are or what they believe, but how are you directing that anger to help fuel you, to push those issues that are so important to you? And that's now one of the visuals in my mind. Is it's like, it is different as a woman. It is different as a person of color. It's different as someone who's younger. It's different as someone who doesn't know all of the fancy words sometimes that people use when they're making academic arguments about things. It is going to be different, but you got to use that, recognize that I still have privilege. I still have immense privilege of the position I'm in and the platform I've been given. And how do I use that frustration to keep elevating those voices, to keep trying to point out that this isn't okay? Even if I pay a personal price for it, it's so important that we're here. But again, this is why I always talk about, when you're going to run, you've got to recognize it is hard to be in the spotlight as a person of color, as a young person, as a woman. But that fight has fueled some great policy work that we've tried to advance at the city that wouldn't have been possible. And so many people come up to me on the street and say how grateful they are, how represented and how seen they feel. And that's, in the end, all that matters. If that's all I can do is help people for the next couple of years feel heard and feel seen, I will feel like I did a good job of elevating the community that needed to be heard.
Thank you so much. And I agree with Morningstar put in the chat. That was such powerful storytelling. Imagine that all city council members were this passionate and as caring. So very kind comment there. Something that we've talked about a little bit broadly is environmental justice. And I know that's another issue that is very close to your heart, which is also, of course, intersecting with the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue in many ways. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about your work in environmental justice and how you view these things to be connected.
Yeah, always love to talk about environmental justice. It's still part of what I do part-time. I grew up in Kern County. I grew up in Oildale. I grew up surrounded by the largest oil fields in California and in the country. And I didn't really know that anything was wrong with that. I thought all the kids had inhalers because all the kids I went to school with had inhalers. I just thought that that's how you felt when you ran, is that you ran until you ran out of breath and then you stopped and took your inhaler. And then when you felt better, you started running again. It didn't even occur to me that something was wrong with that. And it wasn't until I got to school that I remember there was an extra credit seminar, as some of you may be familiar, where you're like, oh, if you go, you'll get some extra points. And I went, and this woman was talking about environmental justice. And the example she gave was kids who grew up in the Central Valley with asthma. And I was like, wait a minute. I'm like that's like what do you even mean? And it actually took me several years until I was doing work in the community that it really started to crystallize for me that people of color have ended up in parts of the state through segregation, through relocation, through redlining, through, you name it, racist land use policy that has led people of color to be more likely to live in parts of the state and parts of the community where there is more pollution, has been led, communities that were built to be exclusively white to have more of those amenities that we all want, tree canopy, nice walkable roads, all the great schools, how that's really racist land use segregation practice really led to what we now know as the modern day environmental justice movement, which is very rooted in confronting the power and the systemic racism that have led communities of color to not just be more burdened environmentally, but to also be more at risk and as climate change progresses, to be less resilient because we don't have the same tools at our disposal as other communities do. There's a map, actually, I have a great visual that I could share another time of of environmental justice neighborhoods in the state that's by zip code. And when they first made that map, they had race as one of the factors. It's all these social factors and environmental factors to create a score of risk. And they had race as a factor. And so of course, everybody freaked out. You can't have race as a factor on this map. So they took it out. And my friend who was running the process said, when they took that out, it changed the score of like 7 census tracts in the state of California. That like the correlation between people of color and like those who had high social risk and high environmental risk was so strong that taking out race didn't matter because it essentially was a map of where communities of color have historically been located. It's also why I'm so passionate about housing justice, because as gentrification happens, as displacement happens, the neighborhoods that are vulnerable for that are the ones that have been disinvested, right? It is the Oak Parks of Sacramento. It is the Del Paso Heights of Sacramento. This isn't a coincidence that those are now the prime opportunities for great real estate growth because they've been kept down by disinvestment. They've been kept down by segregation. And so we have to be very conscious also in all of our work of how do we prevent the continued displacement. As I mentioned earlier, this is a crux of colonization continued is how do we confront people being able to literally live in their place and to have a voice in how their place is shaped and to be able to be benefiting from those improvements when they come in, because it doesn't matter how great the environmental improvement is. If you address the source, you shut down the power plant, you address the issue, you plant the trees, if all the people you hope would benefit have moved away because they've been forced to by these systems, then that's not justice. That's again just colonization continuing to manifest in real life. So I'm very passionate and very fortunate to continue to work with groups who organize back where I'm from, where my family still lives in Kern County, to help them in state policy work on these issues. It's a great privilege for me and work that I think I'll always do, even if it's paid, if it's unpaid. This is part of my journey, and it's again in solidarity. It's a part of all of our journey. If they keep extracting oil at this rate in Kern County, we will all suffer from those impacts, not just the communities that live there. So I think it's very important that we recognize these systems, and it's all connected, right? We're all fighting the same fight. We just might be fighting it in different arenas, but we're all attacking that same monster in the middle of the arena of colonization and racism.
So I don't see any more audience questions, so maybe we can do one last one. So many of the people attending today are students that are interested in learning more about this issue of violence against Indigenous women in Sacramento, in the state, the country, and then internationally as well. So I was curious, for those people who maybe came in a little late and didn't get to hear some of your backstory, what would you say are some key takeaways to take away from your keynote today as we move forward into the panel at 1:30?
Mm. But there is great power in solidarity, and just lifting and speaking a history of lifting up a voice of bringing into a space these needs and these issues and these dynamics. So don't be afraid to use that voice, because that is part of how colonization works, I think, is making us feel like our voice doesn't belong, or that the story is not appropriate, or maybe we should bring it up somewhere else. No, that now is the time and now is the moment. If you think of it, you should vocalize it. I will also say that I think we have to recognize those systems as systems, and recognize the solidarity those of us have as people of color in fighting that system together. It is so interconnected to every struggle we have, whether it's, violence and systemic violence, or investment, or economic development, or housing justice, or, you name it. These systems are present in so many spaces that, we need to recognize what we're fighting against, so that we can be strategic in how we restore ourselves and maintain that fight, but also in what we aim it at. Because too often the system, we aim it at each other and not at the system that's forcing us to fight for these resources, or to fight for this attention. And finally, I think, and I know I didn't say this super directly, but you might have heard that I believe it's just so important that you do work that you're passionate about, and that you find a way to do that work. And as well, I've been so social justice oriented that you'd be surprised to hear that I've always had a job. I've always been able to figure out a way to do this, either paid or unpaid, whether I was doing it as a volunteer, or doing it at a nonprofit, or doing it at the legislature. I always have found a way to advance this work that I was passionate about. And if you're listening to this webinar and you're thinking, this is lighting a fire in my chest, this is something that I want to do, you can find a way to do it. Maybe it's running for office someday. Maybe it's volunteering with Morning Star, other organizations on this call. Maybe it's just by showing up in your community and going to events and helping out with these great activities to promote culture and restoring in your neighborhood. There's so much that you can do, and it really is just a matter of you pursuing that passion, and being fearless that the outcome will work itself out. My dad used to always say, don't worry, it'll work out. And I'm like, how can you be so confident? And he believes if you were doing the right thing for the right reason, that it would always work out, even if it was hard. So I hope you will hear that, and sort of my passion for what I get to do today, and my privilege of being a council member and an organizer and an advocate is I've always gotten the privilege of doing work that I care about, even if I wasn't making a lot of money or any money, and I was always able to figure it out. And that it's important that you find a way to exercise that passion in what you do moving forward from this institution.
Thank you so much, Katie. We just had another person ask for your email, if you wouldn't mind to just re-upping that in the chat. It was several comments ago. We can get your email back in the chat. Katie, thank you so much for speaking. Like I said, this was a very, very diverse group, so many different groups here, students, academics, people from the local tribes. So many of our panelists are already here to listen to your keynote, and I know that you gave us all a lot to think about and a lot to move forward with as we move into the panel. You are a city councilwoman from District 4, and I know that you're incredibly busy. So I know on behalf of Chris Shea, we're so thankful that you were able to be here today with us and to talk about all of these important issues. Thank you so much, Katie. And I'm sure that there's going to be comments in the chat thanking you for such an amazing talk today. For everyone else, part 2 of this amazing day is starting at 1:30. So we're going to have about 15 minutes to listen to music, see some images, and then we will have an amazing panel with our 4 community activists talking more about this issue. Katie, thank you so much again for being here. Like I said, City Councilwoman is incredibly busy, but said yes right away about being here for Chris Shea and Sac State, which I think just speaks to the amazing councilwoman that you are. So thank you so much. So I will turn it over to Luis, who's going to help with the music. Thank you so much again, and we will see everybody at 1:30 in about 15 minutes for part 2 of this amazing event. Thank you all.